You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 95 Podcast. This is Dale Sellers, Executive Director at 95 Network, and I'm so thankful today to have another wonderful friend, I would say, joining me today. Jeff Clark is here. He works with the Rural Matters Institute. Jeff, how you doing this morning?
I'm just doing very well on a gray, cloudy morning, but I'm doing well.
And where do you live?
I live right now in Richmond, Virginia.
Yeah, Virginia. Now, if I remember correctly, are you on a family farm? Is that what I remember?
I grew up on a family farm back in Tennessee.
Yes. Okay, that's what it was. You saw me. I seen a picture. You shared with me a picture recently, a while back, but I remember that. And beautiful place, wonderful. Yeah. Well, here's what I want to do, Jeff. You have your finger on the pulse of a lot of things going on, specifically in small churches and rural churches, and so a part of what I want to talk about today is what you do with that. But before we do, take a little bit and just let everybody get to know who Jeff Clark is and a little bit of your story.
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in Winchester, Tennessee. It's where Appalachia ends and Southern culture begins. So my county had two different distinct cultures, still does. I grew up more on the Appalachian side. My grandparents taught school up on the mountain, they said. First through third in one room, fourth through sixth in the other room. They were the two teachers.
Wow.
I grew up on the farm my dad grew up on, his dad grew up on, his dad grew up on, his dad grew up on. Been Clark's there since the 1790s.
Wow.
It's old. Our farm is the Bethel Clark farm is next to the Merle Clark farm, the Charlie Clark farm, the Laverne Clark farm, and the Thelberta Sells. She married a Sells. She was a Clark.
Okay. Well, now, was it Lewis and Clark? Are you kin to those guys?
No. I had a lady one time in West Virginia come up to me and say, "My last name is Clark. We might be related." I said, "Do you have any family in jail?" She said, "No." I said, "We're not related."
It was a little different time back in that part of Tennessee back in the day.
Yes, definitely. Any preconceived notion you have of hillbillies is true of somebody in my family. I grew up just traditional country, on a farm. We had milk cows, pigs, chickens, horses, dogs, just your whatever your picture is. For a lot of people who don't know that culture, it's a subsistence farm. We had everything we needed just about to take care of ourselves.
Well, that's kind of where things are going back to nowadays, oddly enough.
Yes.
Well, take us on the journey from growing up on the farm.
I grew up, went to a little country church where, 60 on Easter Sunday was a big Sunday. The church my parents go to now, when I was growing up, had a whole separate building just dedicated to bathrooms.
Oh, wow.
It was an outhouse, and, that was the culture of the day. I grew up, I went off to college, seminary, and then wanted to do missions my whole life. So the first 17 years we did missions in the United States of starting churches. Started in remote northern Michigan, 5 hours north of Detroit.
That is remote.
Yes, I started a church in Florida, one in Tennessee. Then church starting became very popular, and I became a church starter strategist for the state of West Virginia. And then from there, I became the executive director for Southern Baptist work in Montana.
Wow.
And then in a curious turn of events, and a story that's too long to tell here, God led us to do overseas missions. And we moved to China and Taiwan, where I became a research person for the International Mission Board and kept up with people groups in East Asia. I also did training primarily of rural pastors in rural settings in those countries of China, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, all along the Pacific Rim there, helping train, again, pastors, lay people how to start churches. So my background, all I know is rural.
All right, before we go any further, I've got to go. How does Jeff come from this country, rural Tennessee background, and then the next thing he's planting churches all over the place? How did you become a Christian? Or when, I should say.
God snuck up on me.
Okay.
Tell you the truth. We had a pro-life stance in my family. If you want to live, you go to church. So I went to church every Sunday, thinking when I get out of high school, I'm free.
Mm-hmm.
In my senior year in high school, out of left field, going to an event, God spoke to me. Mm-hmm. And in that event, I gave my life a complete authority to Jesus. Mm-hmm. Saying, whatever you want to use me for, do with me, I'm yours. And so immediately felt from that point that I'm supposed to do ministry. Okay. Now, coming where I'm from, that meant either a preacher, a minister of youth, or a minister of music. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know anything else really. My eyes were open to missions when I was in seminary. I took 6 months off. Now, here's my Appalachian culture showing. Mm-hmm. In 1984, the Home Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention asked me if I'd play my 5-string banjo for the World's Fair in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. So I went down and played my banjo out on Bourbon Street in the French Quarter, gathering up crowds and passing out tracts and witnessing. Mm-hmm. And there on Bourbon Street, I met my wife.
You met your wife on Bourbon Street. That's a pretty
cool. Not many
cool
pastors
story.
Can say that.
No, they can't. On a mission trip.
Wouldn't do so if they could. Mm-hmm. She helped pass out tracts and help witness. And we just knew we're supposed to do missions from the time we met. And so that started us on the track. Back then, you couldn't go overseas until you served 2 years in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so we went to northern Michigan to start a church and planned to stay there 2 years and then go overseas. But due to some health issues, my wife's father died and her mother came to live with us. For the next 17 years, we served in the U.S.
Now, Jeff, so you're doing, was there any ministry background in your family? Anybody else had done ministry? Because you made the statement earlier that about the jail.
Yeah. No, my family started going to church when I was 5 years old. Okay. They realized we're going to need a village to raise the idiot. And so they just...
Folks, he said that, I didn't.
Well, they... I don't know. I think they felt like they needed to get... that you're supposed to go to church. And so we went to the closest church to our house out in the countryside. Mm-hmm. And that started my Christian journey. Okay. But nobody in my family really had any. I had a great grandfather who was a Methodist preacher, mm-hmm. but was long gone before I was born.
Okay. All right. So you're doing missions work, fast forwarding to China, you're doing all that. Mm-hmm. And so what takes place in that arena?
And again, a lot of that was training pastors and lay people in villages and countryside, mm-hmm. how to start simple, reproducible churches. Mm-hmm. I also, like I said, kept up with all the different people groups that are in East Asia. That was my daytime job, keeping up with all the 615 different groups that were in the area at the time. Mm-hmm. About 4 years ago, Wheaton College and IMB worked together to make a dual role where I did a project on rural research around the world. Mm-hmm. And I also then worked with Wheaton College to do rural work here in the United States. So I was the most rural person that both organizations knew. And so here I am doing rural work literally in the U.S. and around the world.
And that's the Rural Matters Institute. Is that where it came from?
Yes, Rural Matters Institute. I lead that group for Wheaton College, and then I lead the rural research at IMB.
So I'm assuming, I think John Sanders is our mutual connection because he was working with you guys at one point as well. So, so what does Rural Matters Institute do today?
Well, the things we're doing today, a lot of training, a lot of resource. One of the main things I feel like I am a connector.
Okay.
So I get this a lot. Somebody calls me and says, I need help with putting together a youth group in a rural setting. Who do you know that can help me with that? I go, well, Doug and Dawn Rutledge up in Hillsdale, Michigan, have an organization dedicated to this. Let me get you their contact information. Then the next person says, I'm looking to start a church up in New England area. Okay, there's Acts 29 up there, different organizations that I can connect you with. So I do a lot of connecting, and part of that connecting is I bring rural leaders together across the country for webinars on issues that pertain to the rural setting. We just had one in January on bivocationalism, and had a guy come and speak about that, and then have dialogue, people asking questions about key things, what they're seeing as big events, big issues in bivocationalism. So I do a lot of, again, that's a form of training, but connecting as well.
Well, I had I was on that particular podcast or with you guys, and then Ira was on there as well. Our dear friend. I had Ira on the podcast recently, and he made this statement that I thought was a really good way to say. He said, bivocationalism, and now it's got co-vocational, and there's like 4 more versions of it.
Right.
But he said it's trendy, but it's not trending because it's always been. We're just talking about it more now. And one of the things we're doing at 95 Network is we begun a new conference we're doing called Soul Care Essentials. And on the third session of that is talking about your professional life for a pastor. And we're talking about the fact that, we believe in the next 10 years that there'll be more pastors bivocational than who are full-time. And that's not bad. When I say it's wrong, or whatever, if you are in a full-time setting where and we mean full-time, you get paid your full support from serving. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's also nothing wrong with being a healthy bivocational pastor.
I have not done the research, but I would dare say that there's more bivocational pastors now already than there are full-time, especially if you take into consideration a wife working in order for you to be full-time.
I didn't even think about it, but when I pastored, I pastored a small church for 12 years. I was bivocational the whole time, and I never thought of myself as a bivocational pastor because I worked at a Christian radio station because I could not pay. I had 3 daughters; they were all in either high school or middle school. I couldn't live off what the church paid me. Well, I'm not complaining. I'm just saying there was no way I could function like that. But I've never, till I started leading 95 Network, meeting people like you, I never thought about the fact that I was actually bivocational myself.
Well, there's a lot of it that you don't consider. Again, growing up in a rural church, there's a lot of things I didn't. Being able to step away and then come back to it and look at it from a different viewpoint. Now, I was bivocational when I did our first church start in northern Michigan. That wasn't based on any kind of theology. It was based on hunger, and you just do what you need to do. And what I talked to a young man just a couple of days ago and tell him, you first had to decide what is it God's called you to do, and then second, you figure out how you're going to finance that. Whether you have to work at Walmart or flip burgers at McDonald's, but you have to do what you're called to do, and then you have to figure out how am I going to do that. And God so far hasn't lowered down a sheet full of money for me. So
if he does, let me know the day he does it, because I may want to come pay you a visit.
He has provided for me a pretty good work ethic. So I have work quite a few jobs during different times in my ministry career in order to start churches and to do ministry. And that's just now we have names for it: bivocational, co-vocational, multivocational. It's just tent making. I don't know what you want to. It's all the same thing, and I believe that we will see more and more of that.
I think actually it will be healthy. As I mentioned, John Sanders, he has an entire ministry he's doing with Les Hughes now called Entree Pastors. And the whole purpose of it is to help pastors find opportunities to support their family financially, so that they can do even, I think, more freed up to do more authentic ministry. And what I mean by that is sometimes when you're full-time and you weren't raised like Jeff and Dale. We both have had something to fall back on our whole lives. I grew up building houses. You grew up doing multiple things. We had ways, but there's a lot of pastors, folks listening right now. They're like, I don't even know what I would do. And I think it'd be encouraging to you to at least check that out and see what's possible, because it takes off the pressure of your livelihood being tied to your ministry. Because I'm going to ask you this question, Jeff. Have you ever noticed that sometimes church folks can be mean?
Yes, friendly fire is very the one I used to teach a class on 10 things you didn't learn in seminary. Mm-hmm. And the first one was sheep have teeth.
There's a lot of people who said amen to that.
Now the corollary to that one is nobody's ever died of sheep bites.
True.
So
as far as
wolves are a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, and sometimes churches just don't have the means to support their pastor. And sometimes they're stingy, to be truthful.
Yes.
But the thing is, raising up bivocational pastors, I think, will be a wave of the future, because with the validity that it's now getting, it means that we can begin to raise up more lay people to go directly into ministry with on-the-job training or just-in-time training.
Isn't that what we're called to do anyway? If you go to Ephesians 4.
Yeah, something about making disciples. It's just
equipping the saints.
Yeah, and I think as you're talking about what's a major issue in the rural church now, one of them is it's in the church in general. I think it's a lack of discipleship making.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That we've been real good at trying to make church members rather than disciples, and so we got people who are real good at church, but not real good at feeding themselves spiritually. And as we develop more people who can feed themselves spiritually, the natural next step would be into some kind of ministry role.
Mm-hmm. That could be so impactful if they actually are trained and given confidence to do things. Jeff, I was an executive pastor at a church before I became full-time with 95 Network. And I was preaching one Sunday, and right in the middle of the message, the Lord just put this thing on my heart. And I had every head bowed, every eye closed. And I just asked this question. There was probably combined between 300 and 350 adults in these two services. And I asked this question in both services. I said, if you feel today that you could adequately share your faith, let's say this afternoon you run into an old friend at the restaurant after church, and you feel like, you get in a conversation and they want to be led to Jesus. If you feel like you can do that, would you raise your hand? And Jeff, in those two services, there might have been 20 people. And a lot of those people have been in church their whole life. But I have seen in my lifetime, I don't know what you've seen, just a lack of confidence, just in even being able to share your faith. Yeah. What have you seen?
It's the same kind of deal. And so I reversed the process on this. I often go into churches where the pastor has left, and they've called me in to preach a time or two until they get an interim. Mm-hmm. And so this last Sunday, I was in a church that I had visited a month before. In a month before, I preached about evangelism and witnessing. And I said, here's the challenge. I'm not asking you to know the Roman road or CWT or 3 circles. Here's what I want you to do. Find somebody in the next week and just ask them, can I pray for you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then when I come back, I'll ask you how that went. I was met at the door by the chairman of deacons, who tells me a story and weeping of a woman he met at McDonald's and had an opportunity to pray with her and to witness to her and build a relationship with her. He said, I'd have never done this if you hadn't asked.
Mm-hmm.
I find that we don't need so much technique as we need what's one simple, easy thing I can do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, praying for somebody is a real simple, easy thing, and very few people turn you down for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was. I didn't know what to expect, and so I did this with another church about 3 months ago, and I preached 2 weeks in a row. So the second week, I said, let's have testimonies. Anybody do what I ask? And I probably had about 8 or 10 people give testimonies of people that they prayed with.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of trying to teach them 3 circles in 30 seconds, here's what you do. You go up to somebody and say, can I pray for you?
Mm-hmm.
What can I pray for in your life right now? And trying to figure out what's the first steps we can get to before we can get to the second step of doing evangelism training.
That's so good, because what that does is it gives you a connecting point about the person. Most people, just to be really honest, most people love talking about themselves. So when you ask someone, what can I pray for you about, and they begin to tell you, they let their guard down. I used to tell everybody, and I've been I'm 60 now, I've been in ministry for 40 years, but I've always said, people don't want to hear you share Billy Graham's testimony. They want to hear what Jesus has done for you. And so, when you make it personal, it just becomes easier to share your faith. Is that what you've seen?
Yes. And once you develop that relationship with somebody, they're willing to listen to what else you have to say.
Mm-hmm.
When they know that, here's what I taught every church, everywhere, when I pastored was, I want people in the community to say, I don't go to church anywhere, but if I did, I would go to that guy's church.
Mm-hmm.
He prayed for me.
Mm-hmm.
Another one here I've done just lately, just kind of a off the cuff thing, talking to a lady who was from overseas, and she was working in a store, and I called her by name. She had a name tag on, and she looked up. I was surprised that I said, your name tag and everything. And then at the end of it, I said, I want you to know something. I see you. I see you, and God sees you. You're not anonymous. You're not hidden. He sees you, and that profoundly touched her. I think we worry too much about trying to know 5 scripture verses or some kind of technique. Where if you know your story, John 3:16, and can ask a couple of questions, and as you get more experience, we can give you more tools.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we've made discipleship into a training program rather than a life on life with people, especially in rural settings.
That's so good. What we're gonna do, we're gonna take a short break, and when we come back, I got some specific questions I want to ask you about where we are today. So, short break. We'll be right back with Jeff. We're back here with Jeff, talking through ministry, sharing your faith. Jeff's specific focus is working with rural churches and leading an organization, a ministry called Rural Matters Institute. Jeff, what are you seeing around the country right now that gives you hope?
It gives me hope.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think smaller rural churches have fared the COVID crisis better than expected.
Okay.
I think some of that is because they had built-in relationships that help keep people connected.
Okay.
That larger churches didn't have. So when churches quit meeting during COVID, rural churches kept up with each other. They didn't have to develop a network to do that. One of my standard statements is it's hard sometimes in a rural church to get in the front door. It's easy to visit, but it's hard to get into the church because they have all these deep interconnected relationships. And to get into that is very difficult. But once you do, it's very difficult to slip out the back door.
Okay.
Yeah,
I've always said, I do a thing called Vision Day where I work with an individual church, and sometimes they'll have me stay over on Sunday, and usually I do it on Saturday, and be a secret shopper. And without exception, every church I've ever been to tells me they're the friendliest church in America. And what I've discovered is they're the friendliest church in America till the day I come. But when I'm there, it's like nobody speaks to me. And so I learned this several years ago. In fact, it happened at the church that I mentioned earlier that I used to work at. I was on staff for 8 weeks, and my wife and I would stand in the foyer, and for 8 weeks, no one spoke to us. But if you ask anybody, and I'm on staff, I mean, they see me on the stage on Sunday. If you ask the church, they would tell you they're friendly. And what I discovered is we're friendly among ourselves. So once you become part of the group, so like if I haven't seen you in a week, and I know maybe you got to go hunt, and I go, hey man, did you see anything this week? Or just we have a connecting point. But oftentimes, even in small rural churches, we ignore new people because we're being friendly with the others. And so I tell the church, you got to be really intentional about allowing new people in.
Absolutely, you already have these pre-baked in relationships. And some of these relationships that you have might go 4 or 5 generations deep. That your parents knew each other, their grandparents knew each other, and so that also has a dynamic in conflict too.
Yes,
you can't have a multi-generational conflict, but when it's working right, you know each other, you know the quirks of that family. When you meet at the front door, it's safe. It's like putting on a pair of old slippers. When somebody new comes in, you have no frame of reference, no relationships, or you do know them from the community, and maybe that's not a good relationship. But whatever, it takes time to build up enough relationship for you to be accepted. And one of the things you have to do in a rural church is be very, very intentional about letting people in the front door. And that means more than just letting them come and worship, but letting them participate. We have good news and bad news in rural. America is growing.
Yes.
There's now about 60 million people who live in rural America. And those that, like my county has experienced rapid growth since I was a child. It's just quadrupled in size. And I tell the people in my hometown, the churches in my hometown, there's good news and bad news. Good news is you've got a lot of people coming. The bad news is they're not like you.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to be very, very intentional. They want to come to, most of them in general want to come to church. They've come to a small town and they want to get involved in the community, and going to church is part of that involvement. But the thing is, they want to be involved. And you're going, well, we've got our system set up and we've been running it for 200 years this way. We want you to come and we want you to give. And after you're here 6 or 7 years, we might let you be an usher, and we had to be more intentional about how to incorporate people more quickly.
So if you're coming in, I'm pastoring a rural church here in rural South Carolina, and we need help with this, and I bring you in, how would you help us? Give me some things you would tell the church to do to be more intentional, because man, this is hard, because it's usually their family churches, as you know, usually families run these churches. And what I know, and I think what you know too, is if they don't change, those churches are going to die, because they've got to be invigorated with new people. What would be some things you would tell us to do to help our congregation become more friendly or more open, if you will?
First of all, a visitor sitting by themselves is a crisis. That's a DEFCON 4 thing. Somebody needs to sit with them immediately. When the church we started in Tennessee, I'd have people come in the front door that I had visited, and I'd say, well, Steve, we're glad you're here today. I want you to meet Mike. Mike is a member of our church, and Mike's going to take you through everything and sit with you, and he's going to take you out to lunch afterwards. Thank you,
That's
Mike.
so good. That's good
And
advice.
so that I did lots of visiting. I'm an evangelist by nature, so going out and visiting was easy for me. But when they came to church, I can't incorporate everybody. I need to get other people to be incorporators. And so I literally prepared 4 or 5 families and told them, look, when people come in the door, I'm going to take them to you and sit them beside you. And your job is to talk to them, be friendly with them, ask them questions. And if you're willing, take them out to lunch.
And if in case anybody's listening and don't know what you just told us, you just talked about how that's equipping. That's what we are called to, because you can't, and nor were you ever called to be the only person to talk to them. You're releasing the ministry to your church.
If I told them, I want you to go through a plan of salvation with them, they'd look at me like, I've gone crazy. But sitting with people at lunch and taking them to lunch, I can do that.
That's a good idea. Anything else?
Yeah, I'll give you another example on that line. I have a cousin in my hometown, goes to the church I grew up in, my parents are in, and just a good old country boy from my county. And I said, Troy, he's really caught on fire here the last few years, solid in the church now. I said, how do you do evangelism? He goes, well, I can't do a program. I can't do one of these things, y'all do. I said, so what do you do? He says, watermelons. I said, pardon? He says, watermelons. I said, watermelons? He goes, yeah, watermelon. You know what a watermelon is, boy? I said, yeah, I know what a watermelon is. I said, how's that evangelism? He says, well, I grow them. And then I load up my truck and I go through the community and I stop at every house. I give them a watermelon and invite them to church. Okay.
Watermelon witnessing.
Well, yeah. And the thing is, you take people where they are.
Yep.
Instead of trying to I think sometimes we try to do a program first before looking at people going, Troy would go, I can never do 3 circles. I can never do EE or CWT or EIEIO or any other program you got, but he can do watermelons and he can invite them to church. So let's release Troy with a truck of watermelons.
I'm going to listen to Troy probably more than somebody else if he's giving me a watermelon.
Well, yeah. And the second thing is he's from the community.
Yeah.
He's not the outside pastor coming out and visiting. You expect the pastor to invite you to church.
Yeah.
But Troy showing up, that carries extra weight. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And so I think we have to move from how do we train people this to how do we equip them? And equipping them sometimes is more one-on-one discipleship than a class.
Yes, sir.
Come out and go with me.
Yes, sir.
How can we do this together? So that we're training them without them even knowing it.
One of the keys to training is to help them discover how to use their gifting. It's just like Troy. And it makes me think of a young man that we used to have who the church I worked at, we planted a satellite church. And so we had a campus pastor, and he was such a hard worker, but he would do everything. And I remember because we rented a facility, and after church every Sunday, there would be this one gentleman standing over in the corner who his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, just standing there till we left. And the campus pastor is vacuuming the floor. And I looked at him, I said, give that dude the vacuum cleaner. That's what he wants to do. He can't stand up in front of people and talk. And so our job is to identify people's giftedness and then give them opportunities to use that giftedness for the kingdom.
Right. And I think because I'm a connector by nature, I see that anything that I can get somebody else to do, then I don't have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it just makes me look good.
It's one of the points when I teach how to create a healthy volunteer culture. And I go, okay, pastors, I'm going to make this statement. And a lot of you are going to think it's counter to being a pastor. But my statement is never do anything yourself. It can be done through someone else. Right. And it's not because we're trying to get out of work. We're trying to raise people up and release them. And, this kind of thinking is kind of, if we're honest, it's foreign to a lot of pastors. They do it all themselves.
And when we did the church start in Tennessee, by then it's my third church start, I did learn a few things.
Yeah.
It was a very rapid growing church.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Tennessee Baptist Convention noticed it and said, would you do a training for us on how to grow a church or whatever? I said, I can't do that. Mm-hmm. And they said, why? I said, I'm not doing it. They said, well, what program are you using? I said, we don't have an outreach program. I don't have a discipleship program. And they go, well, how are you doing this? Well, I take Frank with me when I go to make visits. I take Steve with me when I go to make visits. And everybody in the church is so excited about what we're doing. They're inviting their friends. I said, it's kind of like going out fishing. I get out in the lake. I put my anchor down, and I'm putting a worm on the hook. I hear whap, and in the back of the boat, a fish has jumped in. I go back to string that fish up, another one jumps in. And I said, because people are going out and doing it not based off of a program, but based off of the excitement of the church itself. Mm-hmm. And that comes by handing it to them instead of being the sole proprietor. Mm-hmm. And I know this is a very difficult thing, especially in rural churches where you're the hired hand. And you've been hired to make the visits, and you've been hired to mow the yard, and you've been hired to do this.
Where you're a boss and you work for us. Yep. A lot of pastors have to deal with that.
And it takes years to overcome that. I talked to a pastor, an older gentleman here just recently, 68 years old. That's not too old anymore.
No, that's 60 is the new 40, by the way. I want you to know that. So.
Well, I'm 42 then. He said he's been in his church 13 years. It took him 11 years to transition to where he was truly the pastor. Mm-hmm. And he's wanting to stay another couple of years to enjoy the rewards of the first 11 years.
Yeah, the dues he paid. Yeah.
Right. But again, the quicker you can start passing things off and handing it to people. And if you're a perfectionist, this is pure torture because
can't do it. Mm-hmm.
Right. These people can't do the job as well as you can do it. But the way an old preacher once told me, he says, if you've got 10 jobs and you give them away to people and they only do half as good as you, that's still 5 times as much work as you're doing. That's
so good, Jeff. That's great advice. That's just great advice.
And so I've been a big believer in giving ministry away. And having people participate in worship. If I was a pastor of a rural church right now, I would try to limit my prayer in the church to just one time per service. Let other people do the praying. Let other people do the leading the music. Let other people do whatever it is you're doing in the worship service or whatever you're doing in the ministry. Let other people do that.
Talk to me a minute. So here I am. I'm pastoring a church, and specifically in the setting of a rural church. And I know the people have the mentality that, hey, we're your boss. You work for us. You're a hireling, which is, by the way, not what Jesus designed. What's some practical things the pastor can do to begin to earn trust to be able to hand off ministry? And this is probably just from your experience.
A couple things come immediately to mind. First is stay. Okay, it doesn't happen immediately. Mm-hmm. And why you have to stay is the second thing, and this is probably the most important. The key to everything in a rural church, if you want to know the one key that gets you in the front door and keeps you in the church, is relationships.
Yeah.
If everything is based off of relationships. That's why Aunt Sadie sings and sounds like 2 cats fighting, but they let her sing every month because they love Aunt Sadie, and it'd break her heart to tell her she can't sing anymore. Mm-hmm. And so it's all about that. We don't want to break the relationship. Everything is about relationship. So you have to stay long enough to build the relationships and for the church to believe that you're going to stay. What's happened is, especially with the rise of seminary graduates and so many seminary graduates, we have starter churches.
Mm-hmm.
You stay for 2 or 3 years and you move on.
Mm-hmm.
And that instability in a small church tears relationships.
That's so good. This is great wisdom.
And so in order to provide stability, the church consciously or unconsciously develops a matriarch or a patriarch. And those of you, you know about matriarchs and patriarchs when you hear this statement. I was here long before you came, and I'll be here long after you're gone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, how do you start building the leadership role, as you say? I plan to be here the rest of my life. This is not a starter church for me. If I could spend the next 40 years here and die in the traces, die in the pulpit, that would be my ideal goal. Mm-hmm. And they're going, oh, you're just saying that. Mm-hmm. But after 4 years, after 5 years, they're going, he's staying around longer than most preachers have stayed. I wonder how long what happens is when you go into a little church like this and you're right out of seminary, and if you're good and the church grows, somebody notices and they steal you away. Mm-hmm. Or you're really bad and the church helps you find another place. Okay. So the church then says, if I get a good pastor, he won't stay. If we get a bad pastor, he won't stay. Let's find a really mediocre guy who'll stay a long time. Mm-mm-mm. And so the goal is to be an exceptional person who stays. Mm-hmm. But that takes time. And that relationship building means lots of cups of bad coffee. Mm-hmm. Another preacher told me at the very beginning of my career, if you'll sit on their couch, they'll sit on your pew. Mm. And so I took that to heart. When I did church starting, I made 30 visits a week, every single week. Because in a small church, people aren't going to come because you have great preaching. They can drive into First Baptist in town or First Methodist in town. Now people can drive to the church they want to go to. Mm-hmm. They're not going to come because you have exceptional music. They're not going to come, for your laser light show or whatever. They're going to come because they have a relationship with somebody in the church. Mm-hmm. So that means you have to build relationships. And you have to build relationships with your church members and with the community in general, especially in a smaller community. You have to build lots of relationships with teachers, principals, whatever other businesses are in town.
People in the community.
Yes. And those relationships then give you the ability at some point to move from the hired hand to being the leader of the church.
I want to ask you this question. This has never been asked on this podcast, but I feel like I'm sitting with wisdom right now. And I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, like you, and been in ministry my whole life. I believe that a lot of our pastors, at least in our time growing up, because you're 62, I'm 60, they went into ministry with the mindset that this is a starter church, that this is a stepping stone to this goal. And I wrote a book called Stalled, a Hope and Help for Pastors who thought they'd be there by now.
Right.
Why do we do this, Jeff? Why do we have this mentality that we view a church as a stepping stone?
We put a lot of business philosophy into our church theology. Mm. And I think that that's part of a business philosophy. You come out, you get when my dad graduated high school, the idea was you got one job and you stayed at that job for the next 45 years. Mm-hmm. And then you retired. Okay. And my dad would have done that, except the first 2 factories he worked at shut down. Mm-hmm. But he worked 15 years at one, 10 at the other, and then another 15 years at another. Um, but even for him, even for his generation, that was an anomaly, only because the factory shut down.
Yeah.
My generation, they're expected to have 7 or 8 jobs in their career, each time moving up. And that same kind of mentality then has permeated into the church, especially with using seminary trained leaders. And I'm seminary trained. I'm trying not to talk bad about seminary. I graduated from seminary twice with a master's and a doctorate degree. But when you're raising up lay pastors from the community, they stay for the rest of their lives.
Mm.
And you don't treat them like hired hands, because they're part of the community already. They're already built in to the relationships.
So it's more of a calling than a career.
Correct. And so, like I was in a church recently, had pictures of, literally drawings of their first pastors, and then photographs. And the church was started in the 1830s. And the first pastor was there for 40 years. The second pastor was there for 30 years, and 20 years, and 25 years. And then you got to about 1950, and they started going down to about 6 years. And by 1970, it was 3 years.
Mm.
We could see the effect of professional pastors who were on a career track rather than on a calling. And I'm not saying that they weren't called. And I think maybe I was a sucker for that when I first began. And I'm not blaming people, telling people anything that I'm not pointing a finger back at me.
Sure.
I was a sucker for a lot of the church growth stuff, and some of it I still think is good. Some of it was bad. But I believe for a long time that healthy things grow. It's taken me a while to overcome that.
Yeah, I learned in Iowa that also unhealthy things grow.
Right.
Don't go to Iowa and tell them healthy things grow, because they'll tell you blight on crops and cancer and all those other things grow too.
Well, yes, but healthy things don't just continue to grow. Somewhere around 22 years old, I quit growing.
I wished I had.
Well, I expanded, but I didn't grow.
There you go. Healthy things expand.
Yeah. So somewhere around 22, 23, your focus begins to turn toward reproduction.
There you go.
Because a mature thing reproduces. And so you get caught up in all that mentality of growing things and careers and stepping up and moving up, and it becomes heady when you're out here in a low country church and you're surviving.
Yeah.
And the church has grown some, and somebody has noticed, and first church in 2 counties over says, look, we're going to pay you gobs of money.
Yep.
And give you respect, and you can be the leader of the church. And that's heady stuff for a 30-year-old pastor. And it's hard to say, no, this is my calling. This, and I think we're seeing more and more people who are, you're talking about good news. I think we're seeing more and more young people who say, I don't want to climb the
ladder,
the church business ladder. I just want a congregation that I can invest in for my life.
Yeah.
I won't make as much money, but I can raise my kids out here.
Which is valuable. Talking to you is like sitting in Cracker Barrel or outside Cracker Barrel and having a table on the front porch. I could talk to you all day. Just because of the wisdom and experience, and you're not just sharing platitudes or ideas or ideals. You're sharing from your life's experience things that actually work. But we do have a limited amount of time on the podcast, and so I want to wrap it up by asking you this question. You're talking today to hundreds of small, mid-sized church leaders. And some of them, I would imagine, at this particular season in life, are maybe a little discouraged. What's a word of hope or wisdom or advice you'd give them today if you were sitting with them on the front porch of Cracker Barrel having a meal? What would you tell
them? First of all, God's still on his throne, and he hasn't forgotten who you are or where you are and what you're doing. The part of the Great Commission of going out is, "Lo, I am with you always." So don't grow weary in doing good. The success of your ministry is not measured in the numbers. It's measured in the lives that are touched and the people who, you and I both are now old enough. When Facebook came out and people started reconnecting, we started getting stories from a church in northern Michigan. This youth wrote us and says, I finally found you. I'm so thankful to find you. What you said to me changed my life, and I'm alive today because of you. And I said, Melva, do you know who this is? And my wife says, I don't know who this is. And I'm going, I don't remember this girl. I don't ever remember talking to her. But somehow, in a brief period of time, we poured something into her life that changed her. That's success. If I ever get to speak at a state convention or a big denominational meeting, no, that's probably never going to happen for no hillbilly like me. I'm not going to be on stage with big important people. I'm just a country guy helping country churches, and it's those little stories like that helps keep it in perspective. And remember, for every one of those, there's 10 more that didn't come back. That you don't know the lives that you've changed. Your success is measured by the obedience to what God has called you to do. And just don't give up on that.
That's so good.
That would be my encouragement.
So you're listening right now and you're like, man, I need a father figure. I just introduced you to one, and I know Jeff enough to know he'd love to talk to you. And I'm going to put his connecting points in the show notes. Jeff, thank you so much for your heart and your life. And God handpicked you just like Jesus called the disciples. He picked each one of them, and they were all rough around the edges. God handpicked you out of rural Tennessee and put the call on your life, and he's blessed you. And so I want to thank you for your faithfulness. And I also want to thank you for how you're helping churches today. Really thank you for joining me today.
Let me end with that. When I went off to college, I was wholly unprepared. I took machine shop classes, VOTEC classes, and then became a Christian and wound up at a Christian college with ministerial students. And all these young men with their hair slicked back and could say God. And, and I'm going, Lord, I don't see how I fit. I'm just no country boy. I took English as a second language in college, and so I'm going, God, how can you use somebody like me? And that's the good news. He can use any of us. And he's equipped us to be exactly what he needs us to be. He doesn't need another Billy Graham. He just needs Jeff Clark to be Jeff Clark. So just be who you are, relax, and enjoy the ride.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.